everybody. Welcome to this session, which I'm so excited to be hosting. It's part of the Imagine If Fringe Festival, which is all about celebrating the life and work of the wonderful and inspiring Sir Ken Robinson. Sir Ken is one of the reasons why I started a not-for-profit a couple of years ago called Flying School. So my background is in coaching, in leadership development, team facilitation. And I really wanted to be able to bring some of that world to the world of growing up to a much younger audience. And that's why I started Flying School. And Sir Ken's amazing talk was part of my inspiration, really. So thank you for finding the space to join us this afternoon. It's going to be really relaxed and informal. We've got a wonderful group of people who have agreed to be on the panel. So we'll all introduce ourselves first. And perhaps if I could ask you each to share maybe one thing that has particularly inspired you as a result of Sir Ken, whether that's something he said or something you've read. But yeah, how have you been inspired by him? If you could share that as part of your introduction, that would be wonderful. And for everybody else, please feel free to do your own thinking throughout. Put your ideas and thoughts into the chat, raise your hand if you need to. And we'll try and make this as easeful and relaxed and inspirational as possible. So I'm going to look to Sophie to begin with. Sophie, would you like to introduce yourself and just share something that has inspired you as a result of getting to know or hearing about Sir Ken Robinson?
What are we doing if we're not allowing children to develop their sense of creativity and their own ability to think? And then having gone through my master's and sort of stepped into and then out of the education system, I was like, oh, that's what he was talking about. There's, the school system is part of a system, and that system has got its own momentum. And what I loved about him was just how inspiring his vision was. And I think, like all good visions, it gives us something to aim for, even if we know we're not going to reach it. And so I now teach mainly adults, but also have a very strong interest in supporting children to think, not only because I have two of my own little munchkins, and I think if I can give them anything, it will be an ability to think for themselves. That's me.
Hi everyone, so yeah, I'm Sarah Musique. I am a coach and a mentor, and in particular I really enjoy sort of coaching CEOs and mentoring people that are autistic, and part of the reason for that is because I myself am autistic and my son is autistic. Now, wow, when it comes to Sir Ken Robinson, what can't be said about that man? Such amazing speeches. He's humorous as well as interesting, which is fantastic. As well as I think the link that Rachel sent, I have seen an infographic that was done with Sir Ken speaking over it about the education system, and he paid particular attention to ADHD. Which really inspired me because, he talked about, well, actually, particularly in America, a lot of children are medicated with Ritalin, etc., to try to make them more normal. Well, what if we didn't do that and we allowed them to be as creative as they naturally need to be? What could we gain rather than what do we miss by suppressing them? So I think that's one of the things that really inspired me by Sir Ken. So that's me. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Rachel, for inviting me. My name's Jeremy Barnes. I'm a head teacher in Liverpool, which, of course, you all know is the home of Ken Robinson, or certainly his home when he was growing up. And that's an inspiring story in itself, the story of his education, actually. And he was sort of plucked out of a school in West Derby and given the opportunity to go to a grammar school, which clearly was a big impact on his life. I've been aware of Ken Robinson, I suppose, for many years, but it was only when I was fortunate enough to have a sabbatical from my headship job back in 2017, and I did a lot of things during those months, including looking at education systems in different parts of the world. But that was when I truly got an opportunity to read his materials and listen to his talks. One particularly he did specifically for Catholic independent schools in Liverpool. The conference was hosted at the beginning of 2018, and it transformed. That was a moment for me where it transformed what I felt I could achieve as a head and bring to our school community in the middle of inner city Liverpool. And that's very much been behind, hopefully, what we've been trying to do over these last 3 to 4 years. There are many quotes, of course, that Ken Robinson is famous for, and it's difficult to pick one out, but one that I use that goes on the header of all our staff briefings now is, "What you do for yourself dies when you leave the world. What you do for others lives on forever."
Sorry, I'm in the dark a bit as well. I'm on mute and I'm in the dark. I'm quite new to Ken's work, but what had an immediate impact on me, I just connected with his frustrations about the education system. I was a primary teacher before, just before Ofsted were introduced and the curriculum was introduced. And what I love is the way his humour and the way he exposed the fact that we sometimes assume there's something wrong with the child rather than question ourselves and the way that we're delivering to them or the environments we are creating around them. That's what I love.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Sue. And I've also got my lovely friend Jane Roger with me as well, who is she's not a panel member, but she's going to be monitoring chat. So just to say to you all, as we go through this next hour, we're hoping that we can really spark some thinking in you. So please feel free to put any of your ideas or thoughts into the chat. Any particular questions, we'll definitely hope to take those as well. Let's crack on. I'm just going to share the quote that I most recently read, that I heard when I was listening to one of Sir Ken's TED Talks. And it really made me think this is why I started flying school. So he read a poem of Yeats and then he put his own spin on the end of it. And he said, "Every day our children spread their dreams beneath our feet and we should tread softly." And I think that really leads us into this particular theme of today, which is, how can we help children really think for themselves? Do we do this? Is it important? And so my first question was literally, why is it important for children to think for themselves? What's our take on that? So just while the panel are bringing together their thoughts on that, if you want to also do your own thinking and share any thoughts with us in the chat, please feel free to do so. But why would you say it's important for children to think for themselves? Sophie, I'll go to you first if you're okay with that. Your thoughts.
That's a big question, isn't it? So why do I think it's important? I think on an individual level, I think when children are able to think for themselves, they're more likely to be happy and free and live lives that are meaningful to them. And I think it's only by thinking for ourselves that we're actually able to become ourselves. And so I think it's so important that if we want children to flourish, they're given the space and time to work out who they are and what they want and what is most important to them. And so I think there's that piece around allowing and supporting children to flourish and thrive. But I guess on a bigger scale, I think the most important thing any of us can do as adults is, if we want our species to survive, like if we want our planet to survive, got to enable the generations coming up behind us to be able to think differently and to support that thinking, probably in ways we can't even conceive of. So I think we need to, I think we need to support them to question and to think differently.
Lovely, thanks, Sophie. I'll mix it up a bit. So, Jeremy, have you got any thoughts on this one? What are your thoughts on why is it important?
When I reflected on this, I mean, I think this is tied up with self-awareness, that if we teach children to think for themselves, and we do that in a protective environment, in my case, within a school, there is more chance as the children develop and grow up and become adults, young adults, that they can understand themselves, and in understanding themselves, that gives them a really, really deep confidence to be able to go forward and make a difference in the world. Because what we're really after, I believe, in post-pandemic world, is we want our young people to be able to contribute to their communities and to their wider neighborhoods and so on. And to be able to do that, they have to be confident in themselves first. So being able to understand themselves is very much associated with thinking for yourself.
Thank you, Jeremy. Definitely. Sarah, did you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I think I echoed what both Sophie and Jeremy were saying there. And one of the things that I've always thought since I sort of set up and do the work that I do is that part of the reason why I do it is so that in the future there's actually less demand. You know, what I do is to try to support adults with their confidence and their ability to think for themselves. Because I think, as Sir Ken has said, so much of that has been educated out of us. And if we can, you know, ensure a future where children are able just to think for themselves, have those amazing ideas that children can have without the restriction of responsibility, without the restriction of, you know, well, if you make a mistake, then that's terrible. Without thinking that, then at least there's going to be a lot more ideas that are coming out. And the same, I think, goes for, you know, what Sophie mentioned about, you know, the world. We're depleting our resources, but the ideas for how that can be changed are going to come from our children and our children's children. So, you know, we need them to be able to have the freedom to think for themselves and the confidence.
Sue, how are you doing? What are your thoughts?
So, I think the mind is a powerful machine that needs to be harnessed, and we've been given a mind to use, and the more they can use it for themselves, the better. And also, I think it's critical for establishing boundaries and navigating relationships. And I'm here as an example of a primary teacher, head teacher, schooling improving, sixth form college, a parent of Asperger's, and someone who sits on that spectrum themselves. But having made all the mistakes in the book and discovered the thinking environment this last year, I've worked hard, and my whole landscape has been transformed. Every relationship, every work situation, myself, and I think the hardest work is done by us first. If that's my learning.
Yeah, definitely. Couldn't agree more, Sue. So there's a lot around, it's important for them to think for themselves, because it starts to shape their own identity. If they're not ever thinking for themselves, I mean, I know I've coached a number of adults that have actually never stopped to think about lots of things. We don't often till we get to adulthood. So a lot of you were saying that. And I think the other thing around is that opportunity to make mistakes. So if they're not thinking for themselves, then they're either making other people's mistakes or they're not making any mistakes. And therefore, where's the learning? And then when I was reflecting on this as well, I was just thinking, as a parent, we're not with them for so much of the time the minute they go to school. And so if they don't know how to think for themselves, then it's actually that's where I worry as a parent. I want them to be able to have their own voice, be able to say what they think, to be able to be heard, I guess, by others. And I guess in my experience in the thinking environment, being able to think for yourself is a muscle. It's a muscle that is like going to the gym, and actually my ability to think for myself has got stronger the more I've used that muscle. And so the dream is that we help children to start to use that muscle and practice that muscle from as very young age as possible. So any thoughts on the chat? I understand Rick has a thought on this. Rick, would you like to share what you wanted to say? Feel free to unmute.
Well, thanks, colleagues. I wasn't really expecting to add much more than I put into the chat, but one of my, as I've said there, one of my bugbears is this notion that we are preparing children for the future without recognizing that they are living in the real world now. And so I think that thinking for yourself means, you know, developing concepts, inquiry, investigation, exploration, curiosity, creativity in the here and now, rather than some sort of afterlife that happens, you know, once you've graduated. I mean, Ken was always going on about how, you know, we always assume that academics is the highest form of life form on earth. And, you know, that famous quote of him regarding academics' bodies as just being transport for their heads, for their brains. So, I mean, I think there are lots of learning opportunities and concepts that actually celebrate children's thinking for themselves, such as Mantle of the Expert, Room 13, which is the art room that children manage for their own artworks. And in my organisation, Ignite, which is an education charity in Nottingham, we have a concept called Lab 13, which is a science lab that children manage for their own investigations, and they're developed from their own questions and curiosity. That's it.
Thank you, Rick. Lovely to hear your voice as well. So I'm wondering what examples, what experience have we got of children truly thinking for themselves, whether that's as a parent or whether that's in our work. And I wondered whether panel members might like to give some thoughts on this, but also everyone else present, you know, what experience have you had, what ideas have you got, where you've seen it happen and it's worked, or you've seen it not happening and you can really notice and observe that. So I'm just gonna see who might be ready on the panel to give us an answer on this. I had a nod from Sarah, so yeah, would you like to go first on this one, Sarah?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I've got a relatively recent example, and it's with my youngest child, who is 13. Obviously, the children have been homeschooling quite a lot for the last educational year, and Harper is normally quite social, but with a very small group of friends, and has really struggled from a mental health perspective with that. And that's also meant that trying to actually, you know, sit at the computer and learn has been really, really difficult. And I've been the typical parent that has gone in there and says, Harper, come on, you've got lessons now. You need to do X or Y or Z. Get on with your maths, get on with your English, get on with your geography. And this one time I went in and I thought, actually, do you know what? I am a coach and I support other people and give them space to think. So why on this occasion am I not doing that for my own child? So I went in and literally said, right, Harper, just talk to me about what's going on. And I went through various things with her. So I wasn't telling her at all what she needed to do. I was just asking her what she thought about how she felt emotionally, how she felt physically in herself, and asking her questions about what she could do to maybe release some of the tension. It was really difficult, I have to say, because all I ever want to be able to do is say, you know, I'm your parent, I'm going to advise. But I thought, no, I've got to pull back. So I pulled back, and what came out was literally like, you know, on a gloomy day, out comes the sun from behind the clouds. It was that kind of thing that happened. And I think from an emotional perspective, for me, it was just so beautiful to see that from my own child. And everything that she then talked about in the following weeks, she put into place. And so her mental health has got quite a lot better since then, because she came out with all the ideas on how she could do things differently. And it really, really made me think about, oh my goodness, you know, if I let myself take away some of the weight that I feel as a parent, but it could be as an adult. Any adult can influence a child that they're close to, you know. If I could take that away and just be there to allow the child to think, look at what's happened on this one occasion where I've done it, and how much more is possible.
Thanks, Sarah. Great example, and very apt at the moment with everybody at home as well. Anybody would like to go next? Sue, I'm just going to go to you and see if you're ready, but feel free to pass.
Yeah, I got an example from last week. I work with 16 to 18-year-olds, and we've set up, off the back of the structure of the thinking environment, a group that we call Breeze, and they just gather online and we chat. And off the back of that, one student, she's in, her parents are both separated and divorced from many years, from when she was very little, and she was struggling with her identity because she feels that she had to be one thing in one house and one thing in another. And it was just the structure of the thinking environment that allowed me to just have that self-discipline to stop myself from advising, which is also what they wanted me to do. And we went through the structure of the thinking environment where she spoke, and the premise is that they already have what they need inside them. And our job is to merely be there to facilitate it coming out by not interrupting, by 100% attention, and by appreciating them at the end, and by letting those waves of thoughts come and not intervening. And again, just like Sarah, it was like the sun coming out on a gloomy day, instant confidence, instant empowerment, and a solved solution, you know, wanting to go and speak to parents straight away. So, you know, it really works.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sue. Sophie, did you want to share your thoughts on this one? Any examples?
I think Jeremy was trying to jump in.
Sorry, Jeremy. Trying to look at too many screens. You go next, Jeremy. Feel free.
I just wanted to share with you a story of a little boy called Elliot at school, who's now in year 6, who came through his teacher. He came to me a couple of years ago, about 2 years ago, saying that he wanted to do something about the school, that the ingredients in the school meal, specifically the ice cream, he was not happy about the fact that there was palm oil inside. And again, this issue about having a sort of secure environment, and Rachel's point about being able to make mistakes and so on, I hope that environment supports him. So I told him to write to a particular person that I knew might be able to help. That then, the whole thing then just snowballed over months and culminated in him appearing in the documentary in ITV with Prince William, which was on a few months ago in October. And you know, he's become a little bit of a star, and I've just found out today he's going to the secondary school he chose, and you know, his future's looking great. Now that happened because of him being able to think for himself. And I have to give a lot of credit to his teacher, because I think his teacher had kind of curated that interest. But being able to think for himself had then allowed, within a protective and supportive environment, has allowed him to be able to take on, experience things which, you know, will stay with him for the rest of his life. So that's my contribution.
That's brilliant. Thank you. I love those real life. And I remember seeing Elliot on TV. So how wonderful for him, where it's led to. Sophie, how about you? Any examples from you?
I think mine's more of freshest thinking than examples, Rach, because what it's making me think, like for me as a mum and as somebody who's worked in schools, I don't think children have any problem thinking for themselves. I think it's what we then decide, or what we quantify or put value on as to what's rewarded and what's seen. But like when I'm with my children, you know, and the same, I've had the kids home and with like they're constantly thinking, they're constantly forming new connections, they're endlessly creative, they can solve many problems. It's when, you know, I feel it's more you know, what's stopping that. Like I think children do think for themselves all the time, and I think anyone that spends any time with children sees that. You put them in the right conditions, you give them some encouragement, and, you know, as Jeremy said, you curate it, they know how to do this. So yeah, that's
brilliant. Thank you. And I think that's what we need to get onto in a minute, really. What is it that we could all curate with ease? What are our ideas? What are our thoughts? I was just going to share a couple of, I've been in schools before the pandemic, trying out a few flying school things. And I guess whenever I'm with the children, I learn so much. But just an example, really, and I don't know if this happens in schools that you're in, or but I observed a lesson where a teacher was explaining what needed to be done. It was actually an art lesson, and they were explaining what needed to be done. And then they were saying, go on, everybody, crack on with your thoughts, and you give it your own take on it. But then I guess what I watched was that the teacher was so great at saying, look what Johnny's done, or look what this person's done, that constantly throughout the lesson, the thinking of the individual child kept shifting, because on the one hand they were thinking for themselves, and then they were looking at what good looks like, or what somebody else next to them had done that was really being praised. So I think it's very fragile, our ability to help children really think for themselves, because we can have the right intention, but I think at times we don't even realize what we're doing that might prevent some of that thinking happening. I remember giving them, this class I was working with, a journal, and said, this is your journal to write in exactly what you want. You can draw, you can do what you want. And one of the lessons that I learned from that was that one of the children put their hand up and said, can I draw a keyboard? I said, yeah, of course you can draw a keyboard. And everybody on that child's table stopped what they were drawing and drew keyboards. So it's interesting how that group think happens in school, and I'm sure at home as well. I'm just going to check in with you, Jane. I know you've been keeping an eye on the chat. Is there anything that you wanted to share, any questions or any comments that are coming up at the moment before we carry on?
No, I think there's a strand of people saying that free thinking and sort of questioning and inquiry are, you know, incredibly important, isn't it? And that sense of critical thinking and adaptation, and allowing children to feel empowered to. So that example of choosing what they wanted to do, the example that Amanda's given about the plan to create their own playground and the swimming pool, that sense of agency, isn't it, really? But I cheekily asked a question a minute ago, which is, you know, do we think for ourselves? How much agency do we feel we have? Because they'll pick that up from us, won't they? So.
Absolutely, thank you. So why don't we go even a bit deeper into this? What does this mean in practice? So I think we're probably all sold on the fact that we'd love them to truly think for themselves. But what does that mean in practice? What do you think stops them at the moment really being able to think for themselves? I'm going to just look at my panel and see who would like to go. But Sue's happy to go first on this one. Feel free as thoughts occur to the rest of you, you know, just have a pause and think about what you think stops children really thinking for themselves?
I'm very happy to say me. It was me. With my at school, I remember before Ofsted feeling very free, not judged, not measured, and I think my natural response was to let them think for themselves. Then the curriculum came in and the culture changed, and I was less, well, it's fear. Fear stops you, I think. But it was definitely me. It was my ego, of that, you know, that sensation of do as you're told. That's how I was, that's the message I got when I was growing up. And being impatient, because letting them think for themselves takes time, and not being distracted because it takes a lot of attention. And just what Jane said, if you don't model thinking for yourself, if you're a people pleaser or anything like that, then they were the big limits for me.
Thanks, Sue. Perfect. So much in what you said there. Thank you. Sophie, are you ready to go?
Yeah, and like when I was thinking about this, Rach, like for me, when you remove any one, so for those of you that there's this thing called the thinking environment, which is a set of kind of 10 behaviors or conditions that we have identified, or, you know, a group of bits, they just are, it's not even identified, we've just put names to them. But when they're present, it allows people to think well. And I think when you remove any one of those, children don't think as well. So if they're not encouraged, if they're not giving attention, if they're not appreciated, if they are internalizing assumptions, if they're not valued for the difference they bring, you know, if they're not treated as equals, you know, if the place isn't right. So I think those are a really lovely, not a checklist, but just a lovely framework where you can really quickly go, take one of those away, that they won't think as well. Put them back in, they will. And so again, I think they don't have to be called the 10 components, it doesn't have to be called the thinking environment. But I think when you look at places where children are flourishing and thinking well, whether that's home, school, community groups, I would say it will resemble those things. They'll all be there. They just might be called something different.
Thank you, Sophie. Who's next? Sarah, are you ready to go?
Yeah, sure. I think for me, a lot of it is, if we as adults can't think for ourselves around our children, we're not going to be modelling it to them. And if we're not modelling it to them at least a little bit, then it actually makes it a lot more difficult for them to think for themselves. And I think, just to touch on something that Sue was saying, she mentioned the word fear. And I think as adults, we do have quite a lot of fear around us. One of the fears is, well, you know, we know what can happen if a child does something that we see as dangerous, and we don't want them to get hurt, or, you know, or to feel upset in any way. But actually stopping them from doing that completely also means we're stopping them from taking any level of risk. And I think if you're going to think for yourself, you need to be able to be a bit of a risk taker. And I just wonder whether, if we change the balance a little bit as adults, whether that would actually enable children to think for themselves that little bit more.
Yeah, really good thought there. Thank you, Sarah. Jeremy, what are your thoughts on what might stop children really thinking for themselves?
Yeah, I've got I think 2 points I'd make, and I agree. Sophie mentioned the word environment there. That's, to me, is at the root of this. If we have the environment right, then we've got far greater chance of success. And two things that will stop that are, number one, I think an idea of we think we've got to do so much now, both as in school or as parents, doing too much and not allowing that room to be able to develop thinking. And then the second thing I think is around leadership. I think a lot of leadership is constrained when it needs to be confident. And if you're in a situation where you've got constrained leadership, that then leads to the fear that we were just hearing about then. which then prevents that environment being able to be nurtured. So those are the two things I would think are stopping the development. Is number one, that we're trying to do too much in our lives, and number two, that leadership, which is too often constrained.
Yeah, and quite a few points there, isn't there, around as parents really having to let go of some of the responsibility we feel that means that we need to help our children as much as possible, because the minute we don't help them as much as possible, they might fail, and we don't want them to make the same mistakes we made, and so we're so at times quite protective of them. And I think that's one of the things that really does stop them thinking for themselves. It's the intentions of us as parents and teachers are all very positive. We're trying to help them to do their best. And in doing their best, we're maybe doing a bit too much thinking for them. So I think it's a really good point. I was wondering as well about, for the environment to be right, that says you've got permission to really think for yourself, I'm wondering if there's some boundaries needed so that children know that it's so it's a bit like the boundaries that we talk about when we're brainstorming. So there's boundaries where we go and say there's no wrong idea. So yeah, what were you going to say, Jeremy?
Yeah, I was just going to come in there because this is something actually that Ken Robinson talked a lot about, was this difference between conformity on the one side and diversity on the other, and creativity on the other, should I say. And he didn't say that you shouldn't have any conformity, you know, and you do need, both in the home and in the school, there are certain things where you do need to conform, and there needs to be that sense of these are the boundaries. And it's only having established those that then you can lead to really deep thinking and sort of creativity.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're in danger all the time, aren't we, when we put a provocation out there, that we go out of balance, don't we? And it's always about trying to find that right balance where we are helping children think for themselves, but also giving them support as well, and the right boundaries that might work with that. I'm just going to check, Jane, is there anything coming up from anybody that you wanted to highlight or share?
I think again we have this thread running about adults being humble in their knowing and sort of not imposing things, and also this sense of is competition in schools getting in the way? You know, that sense that it's not about the individual, it's about the league table. I mean, that's probably something that a lot of us have a view on, but it's that sort of what is, you know, I suppose I'm reading from that a bit, what's an education about? Or what is education about?
Yeah. It's so true, isn't it? The knowing piece. I think it's very, very tempting when someone asks us what we think to say straight away what we think. And it's almost like that's how our brains work. If we really want to help children practice thinking for themselves, I think our first answer would probably need to be, I don't know, what do you think? And that's almost like a bit of a practice, isn't it? To try and help them hone that muscle, if we're thinking of the thinking being a muscle. But why don't we get into what we think does really help? What have we on the panel members seen that really has worked? Anything in particular that we know works actually, and is a really good tip to share with people today? So I don't know if anybody would like to go first on that. Sarah, yeah, feel free.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the biggest things that works is listening. So, you know, if we ask a question, listen for thought before we listen for a response, and certainly before we listen to try to respond ourselves to what the person has answered, whether that's a child, whether that's an adult, whoever it is. Because then in that space and in some of that silence is the ability for the other person to actually be truly thinking. And I think if we take away certainly in certain circumstances, the requirement for there to be, you know, if you're with people, there has to be conversation, there has to be speech happening. If we take that away a little bit, we remove some of the pressure to do that, then we're more likely to have people, adults and children, being able to actually truly think to the depths of their ability, to the depths of their intelligence, to the depths of everything about their being, and then actually express that.
Thank you, Sarah. Sophie, I think you're not on mute, so are you ready to go?
So I think this relates to what Jeremy said. I think one of the most important things we can do is ensure that there is ease in their and our life, so that we can spot when things need attention. And then the other thing I was going to say is I think we sometimes internalize an assumption that learning is linear, you know, like it's got a start point and an end point. And actually, like, that isn't how we learn. It's just not true. And I think allowing ourselves and children the time to go on a non-linear journey is really, really supportive. And within that, I think if we can appreciate children for who they are, not who they're becoming or what they're going to do, but if we can appreciate them for who they are rather than what they do, they'll then be able to apply that appreciation across whatever they do. But I think that takes a bit of again, we need to be at ease and we need to have some space for ourselves to be able to discern the difference.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Sophie. So much richness there. Jeremy, are you ready to go next on that one? What's your experience of what's helped children?
Yeah, not a tip necessarily, but I think backing up what Sophie just said around individuality, or as Ken Robinson talked about it in a sort of sense of diversity, we need to value more the individuality of the children that are in our care. So as a parent, we all know, don't we, that, you know, you have 2 or 3 children and each one is completely different, even though they come from the same parents. And it's the same in education. We have become too obsessed over the last sort of 25, 30 years for wanting the children to all be the same and to follow this particular path, or this linear path. And of course, they don't do that. They're all very, very different. So again, I go back to this idea of confident leadership. We should be comfortable with the idea that children are going to be very different. Yes, there'll be some things that we need them to conform to, otherwise, because that's what you have when you live in a society or a community. We should very much embrace and celebrate their individuality, even to the point of, you know, what's happened to the eccentric in society? Eccentricity is good.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeremy. Sue, I'm just going to come to you finally. What are your thoughts or experiences of what helps children really think for themselves?
I think actually explicitly letting them know the process. So even to the point of saying, you know, let's do a think, kind of, so they know that when they are talking, they're not going to get interrupted, and then give it a go and develop that curiosity for how beautiful it is watching someone who thinks they don't know the answer to then uncover it themselves, and that look on their face, there's nothing more beautiful. So to actually practice it and explicitly describe what's happening, you know, not just to do it by accident. Zero interrupting rule as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So even when we're asking them to think for themselves, there's some rules maybe within that help them think for themselves. I remember really being inspired by a picture I saw from a lovely school in South Africa. I don't know if we've got anybody from South Africa on the call today, but they were helping children think for themselves. They were literally reception children. They were 5, and the first thing they did on a morning was go into pairs and share their news. And the rule was that one of them had to stay quiet while the other one shared their news. And that person staying quiet had to keep their eyes on their eyes and give them some attention. And then they switched. That's a process we use a lot in the thinking environment, thinking pairs. But actually, I remember looking at those children thinking, what sort of leaders will they be one day if they've had all of that practice from an age of 4 and 5? And I guess what the other thing that I've heard just from you, the panel, is, you know, that it takes ease. It takes an understanding that silence is okay. And us really being clear around learning being linear or not linear, as the case may be. And I think thinking is the same. So when we're really thinking for ourselves, our thinking goes all over the place until we work out what we really think. And I think because we're all different learners, I think just probably worth remembering that introverts will think differently to extroverts. So introverts will be doing their thinking internally, and we will be very silent, but actually doesn't mean to say they're not doing a lot of thinking. Extroverts will be doing their thinking by expressing and thinking out loud. And again, if we decide we think we know what they're going to say, or we think we know what they think, it'll sort of stop them. I often, you know, talk about thinking as being a bit like a glass of water. And at the beginning, when we ask someone what they think, they give us the first few sips. But unless we ask them what more do they think or feel, we don't really get any further down the glass. So even just asking that question, what more, can really make a huge difference. So I'm just going to check if any of the panel members wanted to say anything else at this point, and then I'm going to give us all a moment just to pause and think about, if we were to do one thing differently tomorrow as a result of anything that you've heard on this discussion, what might you do? And if you could have a think about that and share, if you're happy to, in the chat, it would be lovely for us to collate that. But the point being that everything we're talking about today isn't waiting for a huge system change. I think that we can do things differently from the minute we go and have our tea with our kids tonight to how we treat people. It's almost like, who are we being that allows our children to really think for themselves? And I'm just wondering what ideas we might have on what we could do tomorrow. And maybe the panel will be happy to share any thoughts that they've got first of all as well. So I don't know who would like to. Sue, going straight to you.
Can I just do a big shout out for you mentioning introverts and extroverts, because that was burning on my head at the same time, because that's what's been groundbreaking.
Just lost you, Sue. You've gone to mute, I think. There you are. Oh, no, you're back on mute. There you are.
Sorry. So telling these students about the difference between introverts and extroverts, explaining it to do with energy, that introverts get their energy one way, extroverts another. And because all the way through school, my younger child has been told, I wish he'd contribute more, wish he'd say more. And it's as if we're all designed to arrive at being an extrovert, but that alone has changed the responses of the teenagers I work with, just that knowledge alone.
That's lovely. Thank you, Sue. Sophie, did you want to go next? I know you. I
was trying to think, you know, of one thing that is, like, I think is reinforced, but I made a decision when my children were quite young that I would never make them compete with a phone for my attention. Because whether I meant it or not, it would be saying that that mattered more than them. And so I've made a really conscious decision that when they're around, my phone isn't. And that's really, it's hard, it's not easy, but it's been really worthwhile. But I think if I could, the one thing that I always go back to is asking children what they think and then actually listening. like really listening. It's as simple and as complex, I think, as that for me.
Thank you, Sophie. Sarah, any thoughts from you on one thing you might do differently tomorrow?
I think for me, looking at the world as infinite and expressing that with people. So if my mindset is we live in an infinite world, then anything is possible. And if anything is possible, then it's more of what people have to say is what needs to come out. So just, I think, to continue asking questions, listening for the answers, and not putting any limits or competition or anything like that onto it. And that's with my children, with the other children around me, with adults around me, with anybody.
Thank you, Sarah. And Jeremy, any final thoughts from you on one thing you might do differently tomorrow?
Yeah, I'm going to try and do the same as Sophie, and immediately when I get home tonight, not have the phone around when I'm talking to my children, and then avoiding being a hypocrite when I try and persuade parents at school not to do the same. That's me.
Thank you, Jeremy. So how about everybody else? I've asked if you can put it in the chat, which would be lovely. Is there any particular questions, Jane, that it would be good for us to answer? We've just got 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to check if there's anything that would be good for any members of the panel.
Yeah, I don't think there's any questions as such, but I think, again, if I were to sort of follow a recent strand, it's, well, Amanda's put the beautiful little phrase in, benign neglect. It's that sort of allowing, if I understand that right, Amanda, allowing children the space to get bored and develop their ideas. And then Brian, about a lovely Hemingway quote about listening, that most often we don't listen. And back to the earlier thought from Billy about that free thought is innocent, isn't it? And introvert, extrovert we talked about, but that sort of listening. I mean, I think there's a really strong strand through the comments about space, time, allowing, tolerance, being humble in the presence of the children and others, I guess.
Thank you. Yeah, I think just coming back to what I would do differently tomorrow, I think it has to be this pause and telling myself I don't know the answer, because although I know my answer, I don't know their answer, and I think if I can just move around the world remembering that, I think that would be really helpful. I'm just going to check if there's anybody that wanted to ask a question or share anything. If you wanted to raise a hand, feel free, just in the last couple of minutes that we've got. Is everybody okay? I just want to say a huge thank you to my lovely panel who didn't even know they were doing this about 3 days ago. So they have just completely said yes and are clearly just so passionate about this work. So thank you all for all of your wisdom and everything that you've shared. And in terms of next steps, Sophie and I have been working on looking at the 10 components of the thinking environment. So really thinking about how can parents help children think for themselves. And we've created a sort of work in progress, lovely little picture like this. So if you're happy, I will send that to you all after the session. It really is work in progress. We've not shared it anywhere yet. We're just sort of playing with it and seeing if it works and testing it. So if it's useful, or if you find ways that would make it better, would really love you to let me know and share that with us. Anything else that anyone wanted to say before we bring this meeting to a close?
Thank you.
No, we're there, I think. Well, thank you everybody for sharing your thoughts and ideas. I'm really rubbish at reading chat and speaking, so I'll have a lovely read of the chat afterwards, and I hope I haven't missed anything. But thank you all for joining the session, being part of it, and I think just by your presence is just hugely encouraging that this is an important subject, and we'd like to do more on it. So if I'd love to stay in touch with you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of the day.